Thank you, Mark, and thank you to UCL and UCL Policy Lab for hosting us here today. My name is Harry Kenner. I'm Director of Research and Engagement at IPPR. And we, those of you who don't know us, are the UK's leading progressive think tank. And I am also absolutely delighted to welcome everyone here today, and especially to our speakers. So on my right, I have Polly Toynbee, who is a journalist, author, and broadcaster, and author of today's book that we're talking about, Uneasy inheritance, which, as Mark said, is an absolutely fantastic read, and I would recommend it to everyone here today. And I think you'll be signing books and selling books to the back of the room, so please do take the opportunity. And I'm also delighted to welcome Dr. Tom O'Grady, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at UCL and has worked on the issues of class and politics, amongst other things, and has done some really interesting work, which he's going to talk a bit about as well. So the format for today's discussion is I'm going to ask both Polly and then Tom some questions about the book and about the kind of social science that sits behind some of the story. And then I'm going to open up to the audience for all of you guys to come in as well. So do please get your questions ready. So, Polly, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for writing an amazing book that I think will give us lots to talk about. I wanted to start with an observation, which is you've written a number of books now. And they're all fantastic, but I feel that this one it feels different. It feels very intimate, quite personal. And I wondered why this book, why now, and how did you find writing a much more kind of personal book rather than a kind of sociological political?
Yeah, it's completely different to anything else I've ever written. It's taken me years because I wasn't quite sure what I was doing there. I've been writing it for about 12 years, but not quite sure where it was going. Collecting up family stories, thinking and looking into my own background, my own family. But it really kicked off when I was doing a series of programs for Radio 4 called The Class Ceiling. And in the course of that, talking to a lot of people, experts, all sorts of people, about what had happened in class, about how much it mattered. And as well as talking to the expert, I started asking anyone I came across, friends, if you meet the streets, people anywhere, say, tell me about your personal experience of class. Tell me the moment you can remember, or any moment you can remember in your life, whether it was a child or later on, that you can remember really feeling class, either feeling that you're posh or not posh enough, but suddenly being aware of social awkwardness. Well, if you're posh, it's obviously socially embarrassing if somebody calls you out to be too posh. If, of course, you're working class and you felt put down, then that's a serious injury or class injury. And almost everybody, you experiment, ask anyone, will come up with good stories, fascinating stories. It's a really good way into people's life story. And also about discussing separate gradations of class within families, cousins, whatever, people done well, not well, how they feel about it. But also over the generation, how much it's changed during my life. In that, I grew up in the 70s, when it was a time of huge social progress in terms of upward mobility. Not necessarily so partly, but because there was a huge upswing in the number of white-collar jobs, and so the number of children of blue-collar families who ended up in white-collar jobs enormously increased. And I just always assumed that progress was permanent. O-level history, we were taught the history of factory acts, no longer sending boys up chimneys, universal franchise, onward progress all the way, and also getting more and more equal. Late 70s, because we found in all of history that this country has been most equal. And then suddenly it all went into reverse in the 1980s. Great explosion, obscene wealth at the top of a kind unthinkable in the 70s. CEOs would pay themselves sorts of sums of money. They suddenly began pay themselves a need. At the same time, the destruction of trade unions or near destruction meant that the middle half of wages were held down. The gap got wider, and it's barely changed since then. And Labour did very well in pulling quite a lot of people from the bottom up towards the middle. But the basic structure of inequality has stayed the same for 4 decades. And that's very depressing, that there have been some great social victories, but the overarching class and inequality question is, depressing. And Thomas has written brilliantly about this and the reasons why, and the attitudes behind it that allow it to happen, because the voters let it happen. So that, and then I thought, I would sort of, and I didn't know if I could do this, blend together these sort of social facts of my life, together with thinking about my family. I mean, my family is middle class back to the beginning of time. They've been professors, administrators, writers, teachers of one kind or another, and sometimes married into the upper classes. And I thought, there's somebody somewhere there who's been working class somewhere. Not a thread, not a twig or a branch, anywhere. And the thing is, everybody always wants to find, anybody, who's sort of doing well for themselves, wants to find a working class route so they can claim they pull themselves out. And of course, many have, some. But the paths up, the ladders upwards are stiffer, harder to climb than they used to be. So there was another bit of research that came out of the ASE 2 years ago. They asked people of managerial or professional level, what class are you? 47% of them said we're working class. So, how come if you're, if you're so rich, you're working class? And they would say, well, my parents were. Sometimes that wasn't even true. Their parents were graduates as well. Then they'd say, oh, my grandparents. And sometimes even great-grandparents. In order to claim justice, because of that great need to feel that we merit where we've got to, that we live essentially in a meritocracy, that anyone can make it if they really try, and those of us who are in a position of privilege need to feel guilty about it because we must deserve it. And so that's why I could put together a story of my family. And the other thing about my family is that they've all been on the left. They were old-fashioned liberals, they were anti-colonialists, they were Irish home rulers, punishment, they were pro, universal suffrage, all of those battles that they fought. Most of them lost again, one later on. They were a little minority, as campaigners often are. And I thought, well, how would they cope with being privileged people fighting endlessly for the underdog? And so I look back at them, and there are all sorts of different ways they tried to cope with it. Some of them are comic, some of them very admirable, giving away a lot of money. One of my great-grandparents gave away Castle Howard that was handed to them, and they said, no, not for us. Handed it on immediately to a cousin of Paul at the prospect. Finding out how they cope with the dilemmas I cope with all the time. If you're so left-wing, how come you're so rich? And my father set up an agricultural commune. He thought that was the answer to share everything. It was a total disaster. And that makes it on epic scale. Everybody tussled with this problem. So I thought I can put these together because it's quite funny. And also I'm fed up with people saying champagne socialists, hypocrites. But well, I'll be honest about it. I'll be totally honest. And it's absurd. The idea that because you're a professional level of salary, you must be Tory to hold on to everything you've got. It's a kind of obscene idea. So I wanted to hit back at that and say, we don't have to take that approach. David Cameron threw it at Miliband, was throwing the Commonwealth champagne socialist. We don't have to put up with that. The idea that you have to be either Mahatma Gandhi and give everything away, or else be a Tory, is ridiculous. So that's the sort of emotional roots of it, and how I've combined my own emotional feelings about my family and their struggles, and sort of social research I've done in my life.
Of course, we have.
Sorry, that was a really long answer.
Mojito Marxers now as well, and you find that.
Yeah,
That's fun.
Mojito Marxers, I haven't heard that.
I'm going to bring something else. I want to kind of level the playing field in that we have a whole book here about Polly's experience of the path, and I want to put Polly a question to you and say, what's your route into the path? What's your background and what's your route into this?
Excellent. I'm going to begin by thanking the question and first say it's a terrific book that I really enjoy reading, and I hope Polly won't mind me saying that occasionally they kind of parade of high-achieving others, it actually becomes quite comical. Like, I knew you came from a high-achieving family, but you're related to Bertrand Russell, one of the Mitford sisters, Gilbert from Gilbert and Sullivan. George Bernard Shaw wrote a play about your great-grandparents, and there's a connection to a youthful Boris Johnson, but I know we're coming on to that at the end, so I will not spoil that great story. All right, so Harry had warned me about this question. I think, if there's nothing else, Polly's book is a call for honesty, so let me be honest. I recognize one of myself in this book, coming from an incredibly middle class, also a family full of academics. My father was a psychiatrist, my mother a social worker and then an NHS worker. She went to Cambridge and Oxford. My dad just went to Oxford. I grew up in a family that I think was very suffused with kind of class consciousness. My grandfather, my mother's side, was a Church of England vicar, and they had a very old-fashioned English view of class. You know, my aunt married someone who turned out to be actually a very famous historian, but he wasn't good enough because he didn't know who his father was, so he was born out of wedlock. My dad was fine because he was the son of a doctor. He was also a doctor, even though he was from rural Ireland, which was a bit odd in their view, but because he had the right background, he was all right. And talking of embarrassing stories, here's my embarrassing story. So I moved from Newcastle down to Winchester, aging middle class, again at the age of 11, and was a fish out of water, both in terms of accent and in terms of having very left-wing parents. And I remember coming to school on the day after the election in 1997, and Mum and I had been dancing on the sofa, cheering on Michael Portillo, and I went to this private school, and it was like a plague had happened, that everyone had died. And people were like, the country is going to be destroyed. It's all gone. It's all just, and so I was like, wow, I really stand out here having parents, I guess, like these, whose class background whose political views, so I'm kind of out of step with their class background. So I guess to summarize, like Polly, ridden with class guilt, painfully aware of my own privilege, but hopefully trying to do something about it in my work.
Which you do in your work admirably.
Agreed. And we will come on to the working question. So you've already said, Polly, that you kind of on a slightly desperate search for a working class descendant, somewhere that you can cling on to. You also then, I think, once you kind of couldn't find that working class descendant, also then start thinking about the gradations of class within the middle class. So you talk about no electricity and basic food and stuff, some of the challenges that despite the class background of your family that they face. And I wonder whether sitting under that is this idea of discomfort maybe, but also maybe even like at times feeling of shame, and you talked about that at the start. And I also wonder whether you felt that was potentially a common theme. Even people that have been socially mobile, often feel ashamed about the fact that they've left their class roots behind them. And so I'm interested in, how you unpacked that feeling of shame whilst really doing this, how your family at times grappled with that, because you can see that in some of their stories, and whether you think that's something that's kind of laden into the class system for quite a few, different groups.
Yes, I think it is. I mean, that's why I think everybody has a class story to tell of some sort or another. They think about it. And the gradations are interesting. You talk about our father at that point. He didn't learn very much as a literary journalist. And he had a cottage in Suffolk, which didn't at that time have any electricity. But there was just no doubt about our middle classness. I mean, because in the end, it's just about money. And money's a very useful measure that most, but it doesn't take into account, poor because or people who haven't got much money but are absolutely indisputably middle class, and their children will be middle class, and their children's children, because education and all of that, and just middle class certainty, self-confidence, assuming your children will read books, will play the piano, will do whatever, and will be interested in conversations. And there's a whole world of expectation that gets passed on in the adults, which is beyond money. The money helps a lot. I mean, money on its own will help people into private schools and into all sorts of things. But I think the gradations are interesting. But I think the embarrassments are interesting. I mean, I talk about embarrassments as a child. Say, my parents were separated. I spent half my time in Suffolk with my father. He was contributing to that electricity, but nevertheless, sort of falling into the wrong side with working class friends, because suddenly it comes up, you're posh, and you're one of us, and the difference, really feeling it, and feeling unjustly treated, but I know perfectly well that actually I was on the privileged side. Even at a young age, you just intuit it, that you're on the right side, and they're on the rough side, and that, you're better off than they are, and it's not about just money.
And I think the other thing that comes through really strongly is the degrees to which various generations seek to overcome that through being on the right side of politics as a kind of belief, but also a compensatory bit of like, well, we need to do much more good in order to kind of overcome this the privilege. And it's, as you said, Tom, almost kind of uncanny, the generations of kind of progressive thinkers, leaders through the generations. I wondered why you think that is so consistent across the generations, and why do you think your family have been so influential in the kind of shaping of kind of progressive thought over those years?
Yes, they have been that. I mean, they would have thought themselves losing and losing and losing. And my great grandfather, Paul Murray, who was preached professor at Oxford, kept standing for the Oxford seat, but losing and losing, kept having big campaigns and things that lost. But in the end, yes, the empire fell. He did with anti-imperialists. In the end, Carl got home rule, all the things he fought for. But at the time, and this is what's important to remember, they were eccentric mavericks. They were not mainstream. They were regarded as sort of left-wing loonies. And they won in the end. And this, when I talked about the story of social progress, it was so many of the Chartist demands, it was so many of those people's demands actually won. And why you shouldn't be dispirited in campaigning, in marching, in protesting, because the story mostly has been on the social front of winning, but not on the crucial question of inequality and class. That's the one that hasn't won, that has gone backwards. And if you ask about why we were all left wingers, that's interesting, because Daniel Kahneman said to me, actually, there's some evidence that there is a genetic element. It almost feels that pushing you right. I thought that was fascinating. But of course, it wouldn't be a fraction as important as your environment, as in that it's genetic. Your environment hugely outweighs your genetic inheritance. But I was interested that tendency might be there. All my 4 children, and all of my politics, all of my brothers and sisters, all of my politics, well, one's a bit corbiny. It really matters. It would be an act of outrageous rebellion if one of my children had been a Tory.
And there were a couple of people in the family who were conservative, or at least went the other way. The kind of Blackshire family. There's Rosalind. Do you want to interview Rosalind? And I feel like you're very harsh. There's also the MP, the Conservative MP, Colonel.
Oh, I see that quite mysterious.
And I thought you were quite harsh to both of them, and I wondered how much that was just that they weren't wonderful people, and how much of it there was a kind of, we don't like it when one of our turns is on the other side.
No, she's a real villain. I mean, she is a mega villain, and it's not her to politics. That's a very small. I'm not even sure what her politics exactly were. She was just an evil mother. My father's mother, with Gilbert Murray's and Mary Howard's daughter, and I think she was rebelling against that. They were teetotal, vegetarian, extremely high-minded, had a long and agonizing engagement when they were exchanging letters about whether they were high-minded enough for one another. And then it's, and actually all of their children, all one pretty much went to the bad. Because I think living up to, being with people doesn't necessarily make a good parent. And living up to high moral standards like this is too much. All their sons turn to drink. Her mother, Countess of Carlisle, the working class Carlisle, was such an extreme temperance person. She had all the buckets in her cellar smashed. And she also was, extremely strong liberal and had a sort of liberal gatherings of people. But she was so ferocious, her 11 children, I think all the sons turned to drink. And one daughter was all right, who was married to their daughter, sort of rebelled against all this by taking to hunting. They were appalled, they were utterly anti any kind of animal. And turning to the aesthete of Rupert Brooke type, they were appalled by aesthetes too. That wasn't the kind of high-minded they were. And then she turned Roman Catholic. That really was the end. My great-grandfather, Gilbert, was head of the humanists, and I only discovered this in researching this because I myself have been president and I'm vice president of Humanists UK, so that was very pleasing. But her turning Catholic was very difficult. But she was terrible. Her 3 sons, her oldest one killed himself as a young man. My father and his younger brother both turned to drink big time, and had a mother who was a real monster. I mean, she really was. She was a hypocrite on gigantic proportions. So she's a villain in her own right. Doesn't quite sit in the class story, except she's very snobbish. She always thought she was really the aristocracy and married beneath her by marrying Arnold Toynbee, who was rather, little class, not she thought she married beneath that sort of snobbery. I think an awful lot of people, if you think aristocracy, if you think my great-great-grandmother had 11 children, and you think how many children they all had, their children had, if they all had that same fantasy, I really ought to still be in the class. It leaves, as you know, in all kinds of literature that you read, characters who feel they've fallen down from an imaginary height. I mean, class does injuries in so many different ways, people imagining what they ought to be, or might be, or should be. And she was, I would call her a victim. Monster.
And as you say in the book, the kind of overarching theme is one of them is about the lack of progress we've seen in class and inequality and the kind of social structures in our society, even as many of the other areas of progress, you can compare it to kind of women's rights over that period, for example, have progressed, maybe not to the extent we like them to, but certainly more than class. Why do you think that's happened? Where have we gone wrong? And I mean, partly you tell that story through your 2 books about what happened. I'm interested in where you think it's gone wrong in that period.
It's very hard to know to what extent there's certainly all my family was so the way that Tony Blair thought, so this is a small C conservative country. I think that you're always pushing rocks uphill all the time, more than you would be in France or other countries. I think that's part of it. But the mechanism by which it happened was Thatcherism. I mean, I wrote, do you really want to go into my 2 workbooks? It's quite long. When I started out in journalism, I felt I didn't know anything about the real world of the country I lived in. And I went and took time off and went and took jobs around the country. I worked in Port Sunlight for Unilever and in Lucas car park factory in Birmingham, in a hospital, joined the Women's Army for a bit in a cake factory, and then ended up writing a book which is mostly sort of descriptive rather than social analytical, because I think at that point I wasn't quite sure what I was looking for. I just wanted to find out how ordinary, not poverty, but ordinary working class jobs felt like. And then I went back and did it over 30 years later, when Labour was in power, minimum wage had come in. I thought, right, let's see if things have got better. And I took a I took a flat in a council estate, not far from where I lived then in the posh end of Clapham, in one of the worst council estates in Clapham, where I could take a flat that they were doing up at the time and they could let it go. And I took any job I could get from the local job centre, minimum wage jobs. And I worked different jobs because factories are mostly long, and also I was only confining it to where I could get to from that flat. But this time I was doing it much more scientifically. I was absolutely not spending anything other than what I earned. And I wanted to see exactly what kind of living standard you could have, earning minimum wage, or something like that. And I worked as a little lady, I worked in a nursery, I worked in a cake packing factory, and I worked in a call centre, and I went back to the same hospital that I worked before, being rebuilt now. And I thought, well, I'll make a comparison. And I took my payslip from the hospital then and now to the Institute for Physical Studies and said, okay, in this 33 years, what has happened to my pay in that time? And actually, they were quite shocked too to find that it had fallen back more or less a third. And that's what happened in the 1980s. And the reason for doing these things myself was to really feel to really calculate what it means. And the reason was, of course, partly that, unions, there were no unions in any of the place I worked. I was working now, trying to work for the state every time for an outsourced agency or for Carillion at one point, never actually for the state. I'd worked for the hospital. I'm the hospital manager. Before this time, I was working for an agency, and that was the way they could hold pay down. No organisation. The outsourcing was holding pay down, and that's what had happened. And that's how inequality, that was one of the mechanisms of inequality growing during the 80s, Thatcherite outsourcing anti-union at the time. I think also the reason for doing it oneself is that things happen that you would never think to ask anyone else. So that I could work out what could I get from a charity for second-hand furniture to furnish the flat just barely. What grant could I get and how could I do it? But then you discover that you never have money to have curtains. All you can do is cover up a blanket. Then you discover that actually all it's really easy to sort of fry some lentils and occasional orange, but never wine. You can never go swimming, you can never go to the movies, and you can never take a tube. Now, the reason for doing this as an experiment yourself is to see exactly what happens. You can never, ever, and I never for a minute toyed with the idea I could imagine what it's like to be a low earner. I've never had a moment's insecurity in all my life, never. Any possibility that I might at any point stumble and would always be somebody to pick me up. And never even remotely. So it's not an experiment, how does it feel to be okay, but what is the life actually and how limiting is it? And when people make you go for 3 different interviews, and you have to pay the bus fare each time, and you're hanging around waiting, you're quickly earning money, and you're losing hours of pay, the indignity, all of these things. Really what I'm doing is saying to middle-class book readers, which they are mostly, come with me on a journey. This is how it would feel to people like us who take all sorts of things for granted, not to have them.
And I want to bring in Tom at this point because I think your research speaks to this issue that Polly is talking about here. Because a lot of your research has chanted the shift in representation over time, political representation, the class backgrounds of politicians, and the way that that's fed through policy. And partly what Polly's talking about here is how do we make sure that so many of the people that are shaping the public debate or making policies between have some understanding of what life is like for most people. Tell us a bit about what's changed in this period, about the kind of class structures of society, how that's fed through the politics, and also representation.
Well, that's a lot of questions, but let me start with a couple of things. So there's been this large-scale educational upgrading. Obviously, a lot more people are going to university than they used to. Somewhere around 1/3 of people in Britain now hold degrees. Somewhere around 2/3, I think, of MPs, 14% of MPs don't hold degrees. That's the established number. So 86% of MPs are degree holders, about 1/3 of the population. There's also huge inequalities in class background, huge inequalities in terms of prior income, occupation, all of these things. And I think it's kind of implausible that doesn't affect the way that politicians think about policy. So think about an issue like vocational education. If 86% of MPs are going to university, is it really a surprise that vocational education gets a lot less attention than it should, particularly when they probably don't want their own children going to vocational education. And, I've written about this with Harry. A lot of our work has been about what are the ways in which we can actually get more working class people into politics. And we're actually in discussion with the Labour Party about this at the moment. Some of it may end up in the manifesto, but the big barriers are a couple of things. One is actually just expensive standing for office. It's enormously expensive to become an MP. People like to spend tens of thousands of pounds of their own money, end up almost bankrupting themselves in the process of standing for election or becoming an MP. So there are huge monetary barriers actually to becoming a politician that we'd like to see removed. There are also, and this goes to what Polly just said about time, huge barriers in terms of time, because what you need to do to become an MP, you need to go to evening meetings, you need to travel around the country, going to party conferences, you need to be traveling around the country to selections. Who can't do that? People who have inflexible contracts and flexible working hours, etc., etc. So, and of course, people need to take time off the campaign as well. Becoming a candidate is pretty much a full-time job now for a couple of months before the election. One of the things that Harry and I have called for actually is what we call a right to run, which is paid leave that should be offered akin to jury service or parental leave that should be available to everyone before an election, so that they have a sort of paid period where they can be a candidate. At the moment, I think it's kind of a hidden scandal. So I do see, I think, parallels between what's happened sort of nationally and what's happened to politicians.
And just to probe on that link between, because you've also written about the link between, I think, class representation, for example, policies on welfare and the policies that then are put into place in government. And we've seen over that period, as you said, social security become less generous relative to costs. We've seen inequality rise. Your research suggests that there would be something, we don't know, relative strength between what's changed in our representation in politics and those outcomes.
That is fair. And one of the things that you see over the 1990s and 2000s is the kind of disappearance of working class MPs from the Labour Party. Actually, as recently as the early 80s, 1/3 of Labour MPs came from manual working class backgrounds. And they did think very differently about welfare. It's true. You can see that in the way they talked and the way they voted. And I do think it's true that welfare policy may well have been different had there been a different set of people making that policy, people who had direct experience with the system, people who use the system, people whose families have been involved in it, who are largely absent from Parliament. Someone like Angela Rayner being a rare and I think incredibly important example.
Can I ask you a question about this? And I'm sure you've computed it, and I don't quite know how to. Quite a lot of those Labour MPs now who've got degrees, our first generation with degrees. Quite a lot of the people who were the sort of like automators, the people who came up through people who came up through manual jobs through the trade union route to become MPs would without doubt have gone to university now. So in a way, it is progress, and thanks to Tony Blair too, that so many more people go to university is a good thing. So we don't want to automatically say that it's a sign of everything going wrong. And the other good thing, of course, is the research showing that those with degrees are more likely to lean to the left. And that's why you're beginning to hear Tories saying, "We're sending too many people to university."
So I think there's a good point there, which is part of this reflects educational mobility. But I think crucially, the educational gaps have risen. So yes, the country has become more educated, but the underrepresentation of people without degrees has grown. Yes, the country has become more middle class, but the underrepresentation of working class people has grown. And that contrasts hugely with what's happened to both female and ethnic minority representation, which have really improved. So as Harry and I have written about, there is this kind of class of the last part of Parliament that hasn't put it under the way. So I agree with you, but I think we should be thinking really about the gaps and how they have changed over time.
I'm going to open up to the question. Before I do, I'm asked you to go one story, and you know what story it's going to be. Polly, do you want to tell us how Boris Johnson shaped your early family decisions?
Well, yes, I certainly will. I was 17. I was growing up with extremely nice other 17-year-old and got pregnant. And he took me to see his sister, who was living in Oxford, and he had just had a baby. And we went and met her, and she had these nice brothers. And there on the bath mat was this big pink 6-month-old naked baby with a shock of blonde hair. No, I thought, that's not for me. I thought, no, don't like the look of this baby. Too big, too noisy. It didn't significantly influence what I'd already decided to do, which I did have an abortion. And today's a good day to talk about it. I have a shocking case today, and the fact that 1 in 3 women have abortions. So I'm not something it's something that everybody should talk about. So I had an abortion. I was very sad. We broke up. The baby grew up to be Boris Johnson.
I think in the book you say he still looks much the same now.
He looks very much like a baby, but equally disgusting.
Great. Someone got mic, so we might. Yeah, great. So we can put hands up for the question. I'm going to take them in threes. The gentleman just here first. Yeah.
Hi, I was one of the first ones in the room to buy the book. So I clicked it through to see the odd page, and I came across the page where you were apparently slightly taken aback when you got into it. So you passed the entrance exam, because obviously your parents would now be proud of you because you've got teen, and they probably weren't expecting you to. My question is it a part of your middle class background that you even apply it when you thought you might not? Because working class people, if they didn't think they get in, wouldn't even have applied.
Well, my education story was one of failure, and constantly being picked up and put back on my feet, which is what happens if you're middle class. If you're working class, you're lucky if you get one chance. You miss that one chance, you have it. I failed 11 plus, so I was sent to boarding school, which I regarded as a punishment. I would have gone to grammar school, but I passed. But I said, I failed 11 plus. And I ended up in this perfectly respectable with the academic boarding school with only 4 A-levels, but didn't include maths or Latin, which I both would have needed to get into Oxford. So nobody really thought I would go to Oxford. Then I went to other comprehensive that started then into the sixth form, where a teacher picked me out, gave me a lot of tuition. I passed the O-levels that I hadn't passed. And he said, I'm going to get you into Oxford. My parents was laughed. And because of his obsessions that he gave to me in Jacobean drama and Dr. Johnson and all sorts of things, I got a scholarship, really his scholarship, which completely astonished my family. And they changed their attitude to me overnight, But nevertheless, was it that teacher perhaps, they said, well, she's a middle class girl, she's got the academics behind her, I'm sure, and also I had read a lot because I came from a family that gave me a lot to read. So I was kind of well educated in a broad sense, just not good at passing exams when I was lazy. And rather nice since the book came out, I've had several letters from people who were taught by this same teacher, not at the same time as me, and said, actually, I was working class and he picked me out and crammed me and got me into a great university, which I wouldn't have got otherwise. So I was rather glad that it wasn't just me, as a middle class girl, who'd been picked up. But, the experience of my life has been making lots of mistakes. And here I am.
Emma.
Hi, so I want to keep it quite brief, but I was thinking about the differences between my financial circumstances, career prospects, etc., and your own, which are obviously much better. But we'd both be described as middle class. So my question is, how useful a term is middle class?
Well, what's your occupation?
I'm a journalist, political consultant, and playwright.
Sounds very good.
None of them make any money.
That's a shame. Well, I think class is full of gradations, and the rough sort of, A, B, C one All of those things cover a multitude of differences, and people feel very different to each other. And as I was saying, beginning between families and cousins and things, a sort of awareness of sometimes it's money, sometimes it's being playwright. There are all kinds of different ways of being middle class, and not the same. It's important to think about, I think. I agree, middle class has now become bigger and baggy, apart because the Americans, because they always make everything like all their clothes sizes bigger. Everybody's middle class in America when they really mean working class. They don't really talk about working class anymore. So, the language is important, and it's quite difficult. But we know as a shorthand what we mean by middle class. But the trouble is that the rich take them middle class. I have it in here a focus that we did of people earning, 500,000 to 10 million. And they all put themselves somewhere near in the middle. I know somebody richer than me, somebody poorer than me, I must be middling. And sadly, the poor do that too, the really poor do that, because they know somebody even worse off, so they think must be sort of middling. And I just have every time learned by heart the income charts and know where they stand. I have to post all over the place so everybody can place themselves where they stand and understand, the rich should know that they're very rich, the poor should know they're poor, and we should know that, middle is not a lot, it's 30,000. Medium, as opposed to average. And ignorance about earnings is, I think, quite serious, has a serious social consequence. So
who would like to come in next? The gentleman just here.
Well, I was speaking of your second workbook. I was initially very wary of it because of your background, but I thought that you actually did very well at being very self-aware of your privilege. I think leading people with privilege by the hand in some way. But I now work with political organisations, campaigning organisations that want to involve more people who are in that context. And what we hear a lot is people from the working class or even lower class, we get talked about as they bring to the room, and we other people who live with these people aren't so much wanting change as wanting to form their identity. So I was wondering what you thought could be done to make sure that people with some privilege can facilitate rather than drown out for the people.
Absolutely, you're completely right. You can't pretend to be what you're not. It's not a good idea. And as you say, it's the voice of people who haven't been to university, haven't had further or higher education, that is missing in politics. And that is, you said, a very large number of people, and their voice isn't there. And it's Tom's work that, and the work you're doing together to try and create a space by which they can become MPs, take part in politics, I think is very important. Yeah, so I'm speaking on behalf of other people. That's part of the guilt and embarrassment that I'm talking about in this book, but all the way through, here we are, middle class people advocating for the underdog, the working class, people less fortunate than ourselves. Is that sounding patronising, Lady Bountiful? We're painfully aware of it. It's awkward. But is it better to stay silent? No, I think it's better to always campaign for other people and hope that you don't think you're patronising. But what are the alternatives in this rotten, unequal society we live in, apart from doing the best you can wherever you are? I think. Well, I don't know. Tell me more. What do you think? Is that a mistake?
I think, as I said, what you do of taking with something like that is really valuable. But I also think there's a duty upon people to say to people who do things from less privileged background, okay, well, how can I facilitate it? What do you need to know? And an old relative of mine used to, one of the great things was he got more gods than he is. And not to be that person.
I'm going to take one or two more questions and then I'm going to release this to have wine outside. And the lady just here on the front row.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I think Tom mentioned earlier that it was a goal to get more working class people in politics. So my question is, do you have any strategies for getting more working class people into the social sciences? And what would you say about that? Because I think it's almost as important as politics.
Oh, do you want to?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you. I think the social, I remember there's more embarrassing class story. I started my PhD and there were 10 of us. 5 out of 10 of the people studying their PhD had at least one parent that was academic. And that's really, really common. How do we change that? I'm not going to pretend to have the answers today.
Then you're right, because it's always talking about other people. By nature, isn't it? You academics do clinical research, researching into others, not into themselves.
I think we're doing quite a lot of work thinking about the tuition fees question, what support, obviously there was maintenance one and things like that, but it's also people to come to university and a lot of those have been hard, so we don't need to that question. And I'm going to take 2 more questions. The lady in the back corner.
Yeah, just I'm going to be cheeky because a part of the question is going to my daughter here, I think. But the first question is about, I really start with what you said about the social mobility there and the thing about people wanting to be working class, and that it gave them a sense of that they deserved it. And having read Michael Sandow's book about the idea that actually the problem with that is that then when we promote meritocracy, what we also do is condemn people who haven't achieved so that they're being their fault. And there is that's the converse, the not good thing about wanting to promote that.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, but Sandow's very good about that. He doesn't really think it matters, but it's about, do we get the right people out there? Of course, it's about gap. And of course, it's about the happiest and most equal societies, most of Scandinavians have shorter ladders, where it's easier to climb, the penalty of falling down is less. And it's not about, have we got the right people? I mean, Tory party conference weren't sat on a platform with the Tory MP who said, we really have to be better at picking diamonds from the rough. That's not what it's about. It's about the concept of the rough. You're quite right. No, it's just meritocracy, isn't that we're not doing it well enough.
Thank you, and this is Judy, so thank you. Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting, obviously, sitting here with my mum, so therefore thinking about generational shift and class, and thinking about myself and my generation, the lack of home ownership in relation to our parenting, etc. So with my class, uncomfortableness, I work as a teacher at a state comprehensive near here, and I'm working the careers department as well as teaching politics. One thing that we kind of have noticed of the trend over the years is that we get now more and more students applying and being accepted to university, almost all of them now. And this is about 70% free school meal, pretty much 90% non-white. It's a very, very diverse school. But I don't necessarily think anymore that means that they will be breaking any type of class ceiling or boundary. And I'm not sure that the correlation that's kind of been built up in this talk between the degree and the class cycle is so pertinent anymore, especially if they're doing often kind of business management at less good universities than this one. And I wondered whether any of the 3 of you on the panel had any thoughts about the future of what it looks like to have a third of the country and more with degrees, especially if that doesn't transcend any cyclical class boundaries, especially when it intersects with race as well.
Well, you're pretty likely to be worse off if you haven't got a degree. I mean, the pile of applications for things, people with a degree on that side. So that although a degree no longer qualifies you to necessarily earn very much, it's become a sort of credentialism that keeps out the people who haven't got degrees. That's all true. But nevertheless, my guess is for your students, you still want them to go there. Not just so that you can get good high marks from Ofsted, but because you actually, for each individual student of yours, you actually would quite like them to go to university or to any good course you can find that seems to suit them. So, you know, looking at it as you do, both of you in the round, it's a problem. But for each individual pupil, or indeed for one's own children, is that right?
Yeah, well, we get a lot of people coming in and saying, why don't you push apprenticeships more? Like, these are the, and I always say, well, I completely agree, apprenticeships are amazing, but why aren't they offering them at UCS and Southampton and Highgate? And why do we think that we can't aim for university? And it's such a conflict, because for many of them, apprenticeships would be great, as they would be for students at private schools, but that's not why you pay your kid to go to a private school.
Except that there are very few good apprenticeships, you know. Rolls-Royce apprenticeships, literally, have many more applicants per apprenticeship than Oxbridge. You know, the really good ones, but there are very few. There's a lot of crap apprenticeships out there. There aren't very many of these really gold-plated ones.
I'm going to ask the last question just here. Sorry, I'm making you run around the room.
That's okay.
Work out.
On politics, you are at the top table being absolutely uniformly middle class, because none of you have mentioned council politics and community politics. And the UK has the lowest number of people elected to local councils per 100,000 population. It's around 45 in the UK, it's 900 in Sweden. Is it not the case that until we reward people who work as elected members in councils, we don't create the kind of ladder that might get a rather greater proportion of people into parliamentary democracy? And I speak as a firmly middle class person who's just recently retired from the Scottish Parliament, so may I go on?
Well, this is what you're working on, so you two better answer this one.
I'll do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we actually find in evidence from Sweden suggests actually that local councils are pretty middle class dominated actually. So I've seen evidence on this that suggests that the kind of, you get more middle class the more upwards you go in terms of tiers of governments in Sweden, but actually even the Swedish local government is pretty middle class. I completely agree with you that we should have more local politics, more democratic engagement. I think in some ways, there's a separate issue of if we have that engagement, are the right people engaging? And I don't think it's a given that just because we open up more local politics, more greater diversity, people with high social capital, time to spare, are still going to be the ones I think standing for even expanded councils, unfortunately. So I don't think that's a silver bullet on its own right, even though I think it's an absolutely correct thing to do more generally.
There's no doubt that there's a supply problem, right? So unions used to create this pathway for people who are from working class backgrounds into politics. And obviously the decline of the union movement, as well as likely leading to worse policy, because they rebalance power in our society and what shapes policy, they also took away that pipeline. So somehow we need to find a way of rebuilding those pipelines, which obviously could be about rebuilding, and should be about rebuilding the union movement, but even if we do that, it's probably not going to be enough. So one way or another, we have to be finding these routes for people to go from backgrounds that don't usually get encouraged by default to go into politics to make that step.
I'm quite encouraged by Labour's policy on trade unions. If they stick to it, its employment package is really good. And one ingredient of that is that every single workplace will have to allow in a trade union organiser. And it could, if the TUC really get its act together and the unions don't argue with each other about who should be in what workplace, and if it really happens, and if Labour really pushes it, it could lead to a huge expansion in trade union membership. And that in itself is the best way for people to learn about politics at a basic level. People who don't have you're talking about the social capital, don't really think necessarily politically, and you just see when they join trade unions, that's when sort of lights come on and they begin to see things, not so, well, I think it's very hard at school at 5 4. They begin to see the structure in the system that has been against the political stuff.
Yeah, I think it's a much underappreciated effect of the decline of unionisation, which is the number one way that working class people got into politics has just been taken away. And I think people don't recognise that fact enough.
I think it's fair to say that that policy, the New Deal for working people that you were talking about, Polly, wouldn't have happened without Angela Rayner and speaks to that, well, the point that you're making, Tom, which is that representation matters. I'm going to wrap up there. One final question, Polly. There's a great quote in here from Gilbert Murray, who says, "My greenness was unbelievable. I believed passionately in the progress of man, and it only needed the removal of a few selfish reactionary old people to make a new Garden of Eden." The idea that progressives are on the verge of this thing, yet it doesn't happen. So I'm going to ask you to make predictions sort of dangerous. What's your view of what's happening in the next election?
I think we are at a great turning point. Read my column today, The Guardian online. I think this is going to be a bigger turning point than 97. I think this really is the death of Thatcherism. Because if you can think of a single Thatcher policy that isn't deeply unpopular now, whether it's, sewage, water utilities, whether it's the unpopularity of the energy companies, whether it's outsourcing being really unpopular. I'm very glad to see Rachel Reeves saying she's going to be a great insourcing chancellor. Whether it's almost everything you can think of that she did. Unions now are regarded as more positive than negative by the great population, despite the strikes, which you would have thought might have made them unpopular. There is nothing in her legacy left for the Tories to hold on to. I mean, they can't build themselves up again as a new Thatcher party. It really is the end of that. And I think if Labour can understand that, they can believe it, particularly once they actually win the election, which they certainly will, and understand that this isn't just winning the election, but this is a real turning point, and make the most of it. Once they're there, I understand why they're so nervous now. My life is what we're Labour trying to lose again. I'm optimistic.
That's a good note to wrap. I'm going to pass them to Mark to
Thank you so much, Harry. Well,